Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a very special guest back on the podcast, Cody Mosley. This is his second time on. He was back on in episode 122, and we were just talking off air. This was back in February of 2022. So about a year and a half, a little bit longer than that. Cody, appreciate you coming back on. And actually, real quick, before I hand it over to you, if you guys aren't familiar with Cody, he is a coach and project manager at N1 Education, and he's also a certified sports nutritionist through the ISSN. And Cody, thank you for coming back on, man.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, always. Once we have you on once, and if you're a good guest, we get you on the second time. And I had some people that wanted you to get back on the podcast. Yeah, looking forward to chatting with you today. And we'll probably keep it all things hypertrophy. But first, before we dive into that, since it's been a year and a half or so since we last chatted, what's kind of anything on your end that has gone on in that period of time? And then maybe we can touch on your training a little bit to see if that's changed since then.
Yeah, overall, the day-to-day is more or less the same, just working on new projects and events and courses and things like that. I actually released a course of my own a couple months ago, which is like I called it a jumpstart course for people who are looking to get into the fitness industry, because that was my background before getting into the online coaching, was like the business project side of stuff. Obviously, I was with K.A.S when we started N1, so I went through the whole process, everything from website builds and marketing and government registry and all that stuff. So I figured I'd had a lot of questions from other people who were following that same path. So I basically just bundled it up into a little course for people who are looking to start their own business and don't know what they're doing from the technical side of things. I was pretty excited about that. Got some really good reviews on it so far. So that was my big project, I'd say, in the last year or so.
Awesome, man. Yeah, that's super helpful. Just because, again, a lot of people do have trouble with the business side of things, right? Like they have a lot of that education. And obviously, if they're coming to N1, they probably want to further their education around hypertrophy, strength, stuff like that. And then so being able to add that in as well is super valuable. And like you said, definitely underrepresented, I feel like, when you get into the evidence-based side of things. So super cool that you were doing that. What about training wise? What's that look like? Is there anything new that you've been training for, or has that been relatively the same? Curious to hear about that a little bit more.
Yeah, goals have been more or less the same: get more bigger and have fun at the same time. More recently, K.A.S and I have been experimenting with some of the things that before we teach them, to see how well they work, as far as the way we set up exercises, different principles in training. For example, a lot of the lengthened hypertrophy type stuff, we've been testing some of that out, seeing what may or may not work, testing some hypotheses and stuff like that. So we like to try and test things on ourselves before we attempt to teach it to anybody else.
Awesome. Or I guess with some of that stuff, are you open to sharing some things that you've specifically worked on or anything like that around that?
Yeah, for the most part, I think the general principles we've talked about online, some of the exercises that we've been using for partials. I think I posted the lying preacher curl thing. We posted that on the N1 accounts a couple of times. So just like helpful exercises that people can use right away. But then more on the in-depth programming side, like that's probably too long of a conversation for one podcast, but that is all going into the upcoming hypertrophy camp and courses that we're currently in progress making right now.
Awesome. Yeah. So it sounds like for you, it's just working on just getting more jacked, but then also experimenting with things to try that out, to see, like you said, you like to experiment on yourself first before you just put it out there, which I think is great, right? Because a lot of people just do things and they don't really actually experiment on themselves. So I think that's cool that you guys obviously look at the research, but also try it on yourself as well too, before recommending things and whatnot there. So I guess for you then what does it typical training look like throughout the week? Are you on a pretty structured program, or is it a little bit more like, again, if you're experimenting, does it kind of change? How many days per week do you typically lift weights and stuff like that?
Yeah, I typically stick to 4 days a week. That seems to be my sweet spot as far as recovery and just having life balance of getting other things done for work. We usually will split up. It's like a half body split, but we'll bias things more one day versus the other. So for example, we have 2 leg days. One's more like quad focused, the other's more ham focused. We'll have a little bit of overlap in the two. There'll be a leg extension or something on the hamstring day and a leg curl on the quad day, but biasing the volume a little bit like that, rather than just same volume of everything both days. Give yourself a little more recovery, especially with some of the different, I guess, methods that we've been trying with the lengthened stuff. Does seem to take a little bit longer to recover. Upper body stuff, similar principles there, but we can get we'll get in more to splitting up divisions of muscles between the days. So some of the kind of more like nuanced stuff like that. But I've been actually really happy with that, because I get to train stuff I like more often, but just making those slight adjustments in what division of the pecs or the lats we're really emphasizing allows me enough recovery that I can hit a different division 2 or 3 days later and doesn't really impact my performance. So I really enjoy those type of things. Yeah. So basically a modified half body split 4 days a week, essentially.
Awesome. Yeah. And I guess too, there's been like that myth out there. Oh, hey, you don't need to worry about divisions of like muscle groups. But do you find that maybe as you get a little bit more advanced, that probably does become a little bit more important to, like, again, and I'm sure that it depends on the person's training experience and things like that. But do you find that focusing on that a little bit more becomes a little bit more important?
I would say so. I also think it just allows you to get a little bit more stimulatory volume in, even if people are like, oh, just do a chest press. That is biased, whether you realize it or not. There is a tissue that is getting the most work done. So you can try and hit that, whatever, 12, 15, 16 sets a week. But what about the other tissue that maybe isn't getting as directly stimulated or isn't the limiting factor, isn't the thing being taken to failure? It just seems to make sense to me that if you split that up a little bit, and maybe even if you just split it into upper and lower chest, like you don't need to worry about multiple divisions, just upper and lower, an incline and a decline thing, you're already going to be able to tolerate and recover from more volume from that. So if your goal is hypertrophy, why wouldn't that be your goal? And it doesn't take a lot to learn some of these things. So it's not like you have to give yourself a migraine trying to find like the 16.35 degree arm path to get the right division of. It's like at a certain level, you just got to get an upper and a lower press or a fly or something like that, and you're good to go.
Yeah, because this was probably a couple of years ago for me. I was definitely in that camp, like, oh, hey, just like you said, just do a chest press. You don't really need to overthink it. As I've learned more about programming, like you said, it for one, it really, once you take some time to really learn it and whatnot, it really isn't super complicated. It just takes, I think, a little bit of work there. But that's little stuff like that does end up making a difference long term, like you said, because then you're able to put in more productive training. And I think as we learn more about hyper, that's one of the big things there is just being able to string together as many good training sessions and productive sessions as you can. And that's really where the magic is there with hypertrophy.
Yeah. And understand that stuff really opens up your toolbox for exercise selection and program design. It just gives you can accomplish so much more if you have a specific situation you need to troubleshoot. Now you have all these extra tools that you can work around with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, the chest is a big one, but even the back too, that's been a big one where, man, that's been the biggest one that it's like, there really are a ton of different ways to train your back. And if you're only focused maybe on something that is more quote unquote upper back, it's like, you can really be missing out on like developing your lats and stuff like that. And so it really opens up you being able to do a little bit more volume with your back, but in a smarter way as well too. Cool. I guess then I guess this is probably a good time to go over exercise selection. Actually, this was one question I had before we dive into that, and it probably goes into exercise selection a little bit. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on, you mentioned different areas of the chest. Decline. What are your thoughts on that? Is that like an exercise specifically that you would maybe have somebody do more with like cable setup because maybe it's a little bit more practical? Or what are your thoughts on that? Because decline was always one that I was for a while like, oh, you don't need to do a decline. But again, as we were just talking about this, there might be a reason to potentially do a decline or something like that. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts there around that.
Yeah. So really it's just a decline arm path. It doesn't necessarily have to be a press. It could be a hybrid press around movement, the one that we use quite a bit. I think the cables are probably going to be your best bet for the most part. Dumbbells, I think, is just a logistical challenge, especially if you get strong, like trying to hoist up 100+ pound dumbbells while falling backward at a 45-degree angle and hanging by your feet on a bench. Like, it's just a nightmare. The hardest part's the setup. That's 3 reps right there. But yeah, I like cables a lot more. And even as you get strong, like you can switch to single arm stuff. Like I've gotten to a point trying to do double arm. I'm basically trying to just weigh myself down, or I'm doing a dip with cables. But yeah, single arm stuff, you can grab something to weigh you down. It's really the arm path that we're concerned about rather than the exercise. And that kind of goes across the board, whatever we're talking about. It's okay, get the path of motion right. And then how can we load that appropriately? There are some machines that you can get pretty decent with. So like the Prime hybrid chest press has a pretty good setup. Some of the decline hammer, I think you can do pretty decent with for a costal-ish kind of press. You got to manipulate your body position a little to line it up. But those are probably my go-tos for a lower chest type press. Dips are decent. The limiting factor with there is just trying to get the right torso angle, right? So that's why we've used like the band to push against with your feet to actually push your butt back. So you're like leaning forward more, just to line that like your body up a little bit better for those costal fibers to work more. But again, that's a load limited exercise because you can't really add weight to that. And the band is technically deloading you a little bit. So you have to use it as like a post exhaust or something. So it's doable if that's what you have available. Like you could pre-fatigue and do just a dumbbell chest press with an arch to get kind of decline and then go to that exercise, dip with the band for a very costal. That's a programming option. Like I said, once you know the arm paths, you can just pick and choose what fits the goal.
Yeah, like you said, instead of looking at it as like a particular exercise, so like I brought up the decline there, it's look at the arm path and what it's working versus, oh, this exercise is good or bad, right? Is what we want to look at there. But yeah, no, as you were saying that, that's what I said that with the decline, is, man, that setup was just always the toughest part. I remember too, back when I was in college, and it was all about just lifting as much weight as you could. That was the decline bench press was the one that I would do because you could just load that up and hit more weight on that. But yeah, no, that's super helpful. I think that helps a lot of people out. As far as that goes, do you have a rule of thumb there? Do you like to 1/3 of your chest training be that, or is it just dependent on the person, maybe what their weaknesses are and stuff like that? Or do you have this, hey, here's a good baseline to go off of?
Yeah, for someone who isn't specifically trying to bring up a particular division, you could do a roughly even split across your chest training. And that again goes back to how specific are you being? If you're doing upper and lower, could you do half and half? Probably. If you're doing sternal, clavicular, costal, maybe it's roughly 1/3. But keep in mind, even when you're doing your sternal stuff, the costal is still working quite a bit. So that's once you get into the anatomy stuff, understanding that kind of shifts your programming a little bit. I'm doing a ton of sternal. That also counts for a little bit of costal and a little bit of clavicular. So maybe I don't need exactly 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. If you look at it that way.
Yeah. So basically what you're saying there too is like each one, for example, decline or whatever it may be, they still are probably going to hit other areas of the chest. Just one's probably going to be biased a little bit more whenever you do a certain arm path.
Yeah, especially in the lengthened position because it is like a convergent muscle. So the more in the lengthened position, more of the fibers have the ability to assist and work. As you get to the short position, that's where it actually becomes more specific to the tissue that's being trained on what arm path you're using. So there's more overlap in the lengthened. So if you're doing a lot of lengthened stuff, it's counting for quote unquote more tension across more of the fibers than doing a bunch of short position like a press around or something like that, where it's a lot more specific to a smaller portion of the tissue.
Interesting. So anytime you're training the length, and that's going to probably hit, there's going to be a lot of overlap in terms of the entire chest. And then that shortened positions where you're going to be able to isolate even a little bit more the area of the chest there with that.
Yeah, there will be more. I wouldn't say it's not completely even because the arm path and line of resistance will dictate some of that too.
Speaking of, while we're still on chest training here, I have a couple other questions. So I know there's some research that like, oh, hey, if you were to pick incline's going to hit upper chest, it's going to hit most of your chest. If you were to compare it like a incline versus a flat press, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that like an incline press is that kind of, if you were to have to choose maybe one, you're limited on time, would that kind of be one that you would bias, or is there?
Part of that I think will depend on the structure of the person. So really shape. So like someone with a very like angled sternum, let's say, so like a barrel chested type of person, when they're on a flat press, it's closer to a decline press than someone with a very flat sternum lying on a flat bench. So when you say incline press, the incline has to be adjusted to the individual to a degree, right? So someone with a very flat sternum doesn't need much of an incline to make it an upper chest biased press, whereas somebody with a very pronounced rib cage, I guess you could say, might need a very high incline to get an upper chest press. I'd say if I was just going for the most volume of pec tissue, I would probably aim somewhere for a sternal or costal-ish type of press. So flat to slight decline relative to your torso, just because the clavicular is such a small amount of tissue in and of itself. The vast majority of that pec is sternal and costal fibers. So if I was just like, how do I train the most tissue at once? I'd probably go for something that's approximating sternal to slightly costal.
And you said that typically, and again, this is going to depend on the person's body, but that's typically going to be like a flat to like you said maybe like a slight decline, essentially like arm path there on that.
Yeah, I'd say actually probably flat to slight incline.
Slight incline.
Yeah, slight incline. And that'll line you up. And again, it's hard to demonstrate on a podcast. It'd be if I could just draw pictures on the whiteboard and stuff, trying to give the people the idea of let's say your humerus coming towards the middle to lower half of your sternum, if that helps as a visual for people.
Yeah. And I guess too, would there be anything that you would tell somebody like, hey, this is like, how do you know that which one would be better? Is there, do you go off a feeling, or is it just you look at like somebody's technique and like how they're built, and that's what you would base that off of more so than anything?
Yeah, usually if I'm coaching someone, I have their check-in photos and stuff, so I can look at their rib cage shape, or I'll even have them film a video of their press and get an idea of. But really, just if it's selecting the incline, I'm pretty much just going to go off of a picture, right? Because I can get an idea of the rib cage shape and I can visualize like where things are pulling.
Cool. Super interesting stuff. Man, I'm having trouble talking. So I guess too, last question on the chest stuff before we go into more exercise selection stuff. Converging chest presses, is that kind of what you prefer there for when you're doing a machine? Is it, say you don't have a converging chest press, is it, hey, you shouldn't do one, or should you try to go towards like cables in at that point, or what's your thoughts on that?
I'll say you'll have to go with what you have available, right? So if you have machines and no cables, then you're using machines. That's just the way it is. I'd say if I'm just looking at arm path, I would like a slight convergence of the machine, just because it's going to allow me to get a little more range of motion. It's probably not going to pin me in too narrow in the lengthen position, because you do need to come a little bit wider in that lengthen position. But if I'm stuck with a fixed width machine press, I may just pick my grip width for the portion of the range I want to work and just stay there. Like I wouldn't necessarily try and go to full lockout in something that's going to be very wide and I'm focusing on the lengthen position. Maybe I just do the bottom half to 3/4 of a rep. And then if I wanted to go do something shorter, maybe then I'll go over to a cable, or if I don't have cables, maybe then I'll do something, I don't know, something else, bands or whatever. And the same thing goes if you have a arcing path of the machine, like those hammer ones are a good example. Even though they converge, some of them arc pretty drastically, especially the longer your arms are, right? So if you have a longer range press, you have long arms, you're using more of that arc, which if that thing's like arcing up and away, it's going to go from maybe a sternalish to like an anterior delt overhead press pretty quick. Like I've got a client, he's 6'4" or something, and he can't use this full press range on those things. It just goes all over the place. So yeah, picking the range based on the machine, that's where understanding the arm path that you're going for and being able to like see how a machine or exercise moves is really helpful for people. They can walk up and be like, oh, I'm just going to do half reps on this because that's what fits the tissue I'm trying to train today, versus just, oh, I'm just going to press everything and now my anterior delts and triceps are fatigued, and then I go to do a different press and now that's my limiting factor, and so on and so forth. So long story short, I don't have a problem with fixed or converging, but just knowing how to adjust what you're doing will make a big difference if I'm using full range, partials, whatever.
Yeah. And again, off that, is there anything that like, somebody that's listening to this and they're like, okay, hey, I do only have the hammer strength. Is there anything they can know that maybe it's like, hey, my front delts are taken over, and again, maybe I don't necessarily want that? Are you going to go off of feel off of that, or is it just going to be you're going to look at like performance on other things, or maybe something else?
Yeah, if I'm coaching someone, obviously I can have them film a video, and sometimes I can see maybe their grip is a little off, or they're tucking their elbows, or they're letting their elbows flare way up and out when the thing pushes them back. So I can coach them through that. Or maybe you have someone they're just trying to launch that thing as far forward as possible, and they're just doing like this full press thing. It'll just add more weight. You won't be able to do that. But yeah, so visually it's a lot harder. If you're just getting verbal feedback, it's a little more challenging, because now you have to rely on them knowing what's going on and what they're feeling, and then try and like verbally explain to them how you want to change, and then hope that they interpreted your verbal instructions correctly and then did it correctly. So that's where it gets really challenging. So I try and cut out as many of those steps as possible.
Basically what you're trying to say here is form videos. Those are the way to go. And checking that out. Yep. Cool. This topic that I want to bring up, it's very similar to what we've been chatting about this whole time. And it is just exercise selection for hypertrophy. And I just wanted to just discuss some things that you're considering when you choose an exercise for hypertrophy, and maybe what makes it a quote unquote good exercise for hypertrophy. And we'll start with that. And then the other questions I have, we can dive into.
Yeah. So first and foremost is going to be specificity. So how specific is that exercise to the muscle you're training? So that's like what we've been talking about. What's the path of motion that lines up with the movement that tissue produces? Once we know that path of movement, we find an exercise that lines up with that, or that we can line that up with, and load it. Next would be like, I guess, stability. You could use stability or coordination. What's an exercise that I can put a lot of effort into that the stability or coordination doesn't become as much of a limiting factor? Now, that's not always the case where you can find something that gets specific and completely stable. So that's, again, where your programming tools come in, but we can talk about that a little later. So those are my first two: specific at least lines up relatively well with what we're trying to train, stable enough that we can put a lot of effort in, that we're not worried about balancing or falling over or resisting external forces outside of what we're trying to train. And then if you were to maybe go a step further, then we'd start looking at the position and range of motion that we're training and loading with that exercise. Is it closer to the shortened range of the muscle? Is it closer to the lengthened position of the muscle? And then where is that exercise hard? So we call that the resistance challenge, basically. Is it harder towards the lengthened, middle, short, even all the way through? And then I'll use those to decide where I want to place it or if I want to use that exercise.
Yeah, cool. So specificity, stability is going to be important, the coordination of it, and then the position and the range of motion there in terms of what you're training. Those are all going to be the factors there on that. So yeah, let's maybe talk about some practical applications with that. Specificity, again, I think that one's probably one makes the most sense. I didn't know if there was anything else you wanted to specifically hit on that, but I guess maybe what are some other things? Is there maybe anything else that you would consider there with that? Again, from my understanding, specificity is going to come down to just, hey, does it train that target muscle that we want to hit for that particular exercise? I don't know if there's anything else you maybe want to touch on that or anything like that.
Yeah, we could just go back to the chest training example. So like a dumbbell chest press, through a portion of the range, it's fairly specific to the chest. But once you get up to the top, because you have to stack those dumbbells, basically, if you're going full, quote unquote, full range of the dumbbell press, the top portion of that range is going to be mostly anterior delt and tricep. Because once you get to a certain point, once that humerus starts coming past your rib cage, the pecs would actually be pulling your arm across your chest. But because gravity is vertical and we have dumbbells in our hands, we can't really do a crossover lying dumbbell press. So at that point where the tissue of the pec would actually pull the arm across, but we're now pressing up, it's becoming less specific to the chest. And now it's getting a little more anterior delt and like medial division of the triceps. So the bottom position is very specific. The top half is less specific. That would be an example of something that I might still choose that exercise because it's very specific in the lengthened portion of the range where I want to use that dumbbell press. But just knowing that I'm also, if I'm going through the lockout portion, I'm also getting a little bit of fatigue in those anterior delts and triceps. So that's something I would have in the back of my head as I'm writing the rest of the workout.
And basically like knowing that, hey, if your front delts are getting hit a little bit more here, triceps are getting hit a little bit more here. So you can obviously make that call, and maybe you have to change up how much tricep volume you do or something like that, like later on in the training session or something like that.
Sure. Or even depending on what kind of rep range you're working in, maybe you skip the lockout portion. Maybe you do a 3/4 range or half range dumbbell press or integrated partials to spend a little bit more time in the lengthened position as a portion, or as a proportion, I should say, of the total set. So just a factor to think about when you're writing these programs.
Is there maybe any other like big mistakes people make here from a hypertrophy standpoint that like you commonly see?
I could probably think of a bunch. I guess we'd have to be more specific. Pardon the pun.
Oh yeah, no, I guess from maybe the most common ones. Yes, I'm not sure if there's any like specific just ones that you see here, like just maybe the most common or anything that you.
If you probably walk into a commercial gym, probably the one you'll see is doing the same exercise in different locations. So like they do a flat dumbbell press and then they do a flat barbell press. And then they go do a machine chest press. That was all the same arm path. You just did it in different spots in the gym. So that's, like we said, understanding anatomy, arm path, exercise selection, that stuff. Okay, maybe you do a slight incline on your dumbbell press, and then you do your flat barbell press. And then you find something that does a little more decline for your machine press or a cable press, right? So at least you're dividing up that volume instead of just hammering the same tissue over and over again and missing out on some other potential growth.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's definitely one that I commonly see too. And I feel like when you see a lot of people training in the gym and maybe for hypertrophy, they think they need to do a lot of volume, and that's what you'll commonly see, right? They'll start to just hit every machine that's in there, and there's a ton of overlap in there. And I'm assuming probably what happens there is that just becomes less efficient, less productive training, because by the end of it, it's, if you said, like you said there, you do 3 different kinds of like flat pressing variations. You're just so fatigued that what's that quality of that training like later on? And probably just, you could spend that time elsewhere hitting the other parts of the chest. And then the other big one too is with I feel like with the pull downs, I'm sure that there's a ton of different people do a ton of different pull downs, but it ends up being like the bias is like the same part of the back as well too there. That's one that I can think of. It's like they do the close grip, wide grip, all the different ones there with that. Cool. Is there any, from a specificity standpoint, before we move on to the next one, is there anything else that you commonly see there that's similar to that? Or is that pretty much the biggest mistake made there with that one?
I'd say that's probably the most common, although in the, I guess, the more educated fitness community, the people who are actually, listening to these podcasts, yep, and that same mistake. But one I would be cautious of is the arm path, right? Again, with the pecs, with understanding how the rib cage works, as you start abducting away from the rib cage and doing more like wider type presses, you're now biasing away from the pec and more towards anterior delt. And you lie down on a bench and you're like, I'm on a bench, I'm doing a bench press, it's chest, but you flare your elbows way out or something. And now it's really more of an anterior delt type of press, right? Chest is still working to a degree, but not to the degree it could be, let's say. So just the arm path is going to be a big one for the pecs and lats and the anterior delts, posterior delts. Like that's probably the biggest one, just understanding how to line up that tissue to be the thing that's getting the most tension or stimulus or volume or what have you.
And like we talked about earlier, again, just saying you're doing this exercise, it depends how you're executing it. That's super important. And probably on that specific one with the chest where you say people flare out a little bit more, again, that was something that I had always done. And from what you're saying, that's going to hit a lot of anterior delts. And that's probably where a lot of people run into a lot of issues there with their shoulders and stuff when they're benching. And also, correct me if I'm wrong here, is that maybe a way to be able to potentially do a little bit more weight as well too? And that's where you'll potentially see a lot of people like naturally shift towards that? Or
yeah, it limits the range of motion because you can't get as much shoulder extension when you're very abducted compared to when you're in more of a pec, quote unquote, arm path. So you're basically doing top half reps when you're doing those type of presses. So I think that's just people like they start doing that and then they never maybe do the chest version. So that's just how they're programmed to press. So there's a press is this, it's this elbows out thing. It doesn't mean that they couldn't do more weight with the chest. It's just that's what they're used to doing.
Yeah, that's what they've learned and have done so many reps that way there with that. Cool. Anything else on specificity, or do we want to move on to the second one?
Yeah, I think we're good to move on.
So yeah, stability and coordination. So that's the second one you had. Maybe hit on, maybe dive into that just a little bit more. And then again, maybe some like common mistakes that you'll see made here with that one as well too.
Yeah, it's a lot like it sounds. The stability portion is just what do you have that's helping keep you in place so that all you have to worry about is the muscle you're training, right? So it's like you wouldn't do a dumbbell bench press with the top half of your torso hanging off the end of the bench, right? Because now you're using your abs to keep yourself up instead of just using the bench that's right there, right? That's an extreme example, but that's the principle that we're getting after. You may have exercises like the press around, the cable press around, where you can do a chest press with a cable. But obviously, if you were to do that 2-arm standing, you don't have anything behind you. So you can only use so much load before you're pushing yourself backwards instead of your humerus and the cables forwards. So that's why we typically do that one single arm, because then you can grab onto something with the opposite hand, whether that's the other side of the machine, a bench, heavy dumbbell, a wall, whatever, that will basically resist that force of the cable pulling you backward. So now you can just work on pressing it forward. So stability doesn't necessarily mean you have to have your entire body locked in stone. You just need to have enough stability. That's not what's limiting your output in the exercise. And I think that might actually be maybe a misconception some people have is, oh, you don't have something behind your back during a press, it's unstable. But maybe it's a little less stable, but I'm trading off the stability for specificity because I can be more specific with my arm path and setup in a cable press than maybe I can in a dumbbell press, right? I can come all the way to the short position of my pec with a cable. Can't really do that in a dumbbell press. But again, even if I'm standing, I don't have anything behind me, I can set my feet. I can grab something with the opposite hand. I'm pretty darn stable there. There's not a whole lot that I have to do to resist being pulled backwards when I'm pressing that cable. Until I'm trying to do a 4-rep max or something. And at that point, now maybe the stability is a limiting factor. So I'm going to trade off specificity for stability. So there's a back and forth sometimes in some of these. And those are the decisions we make when we're writing a program for someone is like, all right, what's what's our goal here? What will be the limiting factor at this rep range? Because it might not just be this exercise versus this one. It might depend on the rep range or loads we're using too.
I think probably a good one, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, is maybe like a bent over row, right? That's probably a great exercise. Again, like obviously probably chest support's going to be a little bit better from a stability standpoint, but then you could do a bent over row and those will probably have its own benefits from it. But then depending on the rep range that you're going to work in, that could alter it as well too, right? You're going to work in a super high rep range. Now that stability is probably going to start to be a limiting factor at some point there on that. Is that kind of a good way to think of that as well too?
Yeah, or just the fatigue of the stabilizing muscles, like the bent over row. It's like my low back's probably going to give out before my lats do, especially as I'm getting heavier or trying to stay in that position for a long time, because I'm basically holding the bottom position for the duration of my set. That's where we look at what are the limiting factors of the exercise and how do we, mitigate those so that what we're trying to train is actually the point of failure.
Is this also going to be dependent on the person too? Could that alter it as well too? Or is it generally going to be the same for each person on this?
I'd say the principles are going to remain the same across individuals. Maybe you have someone just has a ridiculously strong posterior chain and they can stand there and do bent rows with teen or something. But I would still say that the fatigue of having all those muscles work that hard for that long will probably become a limiting factor, right? So I would still, if we're trying to really push certain things, volume, fatigue, whatever, I'm going to try and get something else in there, or just know that exercise can't be taken as close to true failure for that tissue and then have a second exercise after it. Because I might have a client who's, I really like barbell rows. I really want to do that. It's like, all right, we can work that in there because I know you'll work hard, you'll enjoy it. And then I'll put this other exercise after it. And we're going to do 2, maybe 3 sets. And you're just going to go ham on this one, because we can really push this one to failure.
Yeah. So something like that could be do a bent over row and then probably do something that's a little bit more stable, chest support or something like that to really be able to hammer out the muscle tissue that you want. Can you take it too far with stability? I think you maybe hit on that a little bit, but can you take it too far and like overly focus on the stability side of things? And then that can be a detriment.
Yeah, I think, overly trying to overdo the stability can, I think, become a detriment more from an effort perspective. If you're focusing so much on don't let anything move, you're wasting mental energy, which is still a tax on your nervous system. If you're trying to put a lot of effort or force through external, like your nervous system is working in all of those things, that it may actually take away from your output. So having more stability isn't necessarily better. You just need enough that it's not limiting the exercise.
And so my kind of thought on that was like, you mentioned you're overly focused on being stable and stuff like that. Is that somebody that maybe just like overly focuses on technique and they feel like they need to have picture perfect technique? Is that kind of like similar to that? And then, like you said, they end up not being able to load it as much as they want to and whatnot.
Yeah, that can be similar. You over focus on mind muscle connection or whatever that means to you. Of I have to be like trying to consciously squeeze this muscle through every portion of the range. You're just wasting not only mental energy, but physical energy trying to do these, what it's called a co-contraction, where you're mentally squeezing tissue, but it's not against resistance, it's against your own tissue, right? So if you sit there, you flex your arm and your bicep it's hard, but you're not holding any weight, right? So you're not actually, the only tension that bicep has is what's fighting it on the other side, which is your tricep. That's a co-contraction where you're contracting antagonist muscles to make yourself, quote unquote, feel it working. So that's where we've talked about before is don't trust your feelings, don't go for sensation, because if you're doing that type of approach where you're just co-contracting, you're wasting a ton of energy without really creating much more tension. And I believe there was a study, I don't remember who did it. It might have been Brad Schoenfeld on the mind muscle connection and hypertrophy performance. We also did some tests here with our EMG software and stuff of co-contracting versus the load we could use without consciously squeezing to failure. And after a certain point, when you use enough load or enough resistance, you don't get any additional benefit, or you can't really get more out of it. You're just wasting mental and physical effort.
I bring that up just because I've been there before where I went through the kind of like just, picture perfect technique. And it's, again, that can really hold you back, I feel like at times where it's like, again, you don't want your technique to be garbage, but at the same time, do you really need to be just super strict with everything? And the back's probably a good example where it's like, oh no, you don't want any jerking at all, but it's probably having a little bit of that is going to be okay. Obviously dependent on the person and the exercise they're doing. But yeah, just overly focusing on picture perfect technique, I feel can eventually get you to a point where you might just spin your wheels and not necessarily make any progress there.
Yeah. I think a really good concept for that is actually something K.A.S teaches in the live events we do here is the principle of thresholds. And I'll do a small summary of basically you just have to have something good enough to get most of the benefit. And then each like level you get better at it provides lesser and lesser of an increase in performance. So let's say you get your execution to not crap, and there's 50% of your results right there. And then you get it to pretty good. Now we're at like 70, 75% of your potential results from execution. And now you're like pretty darn good. Now we're at like 90 or 95% of your potential results. And then that last little 5% is going from pretty darn good to absolutely perfect. So is it worth the extra effort and energy to get that last 5%? Or should I focus on maybe something else, better programming, rather than getting I get pretty darn good at execution. Okay, now I can focus on other things that are maybe now below that threshold. And I need to get those from garbage to pretty good, because those add up, but you can't neglect any one thing. So yeah, just hopefully that makes sense. So getting to a certain point where it's good enough and not necessarily worrying to go to absolutely perfect, unless you have everything else at pretty darn good as well. And now you're just trying to top off the pyramid across the board.
Which, let's be honest, most people probably aren't there. There's probably always other things that you can always dial in. Like you said, now it's like, hey, maybe your time and effort's better spent towards, like you said, better programming, focusing on some of these things that we're talking about versus getting that last little bit out of your technique there. No, that made a ton of sense. And so let's dive into the third one there, unless you have anything else that you want to hit on with stability and coordination.
No, I think that pretty much covers it.
And so the last one was position and range of motion. So again, like you said there, this is next level, but still important. And I feel like this probably is somewhat related to specificity, at least in a little bit there.
Yeah. So looking at just where the exercise is most challenging or understanding what a resistance challenge is. Maybe some of the listeners have heard the terms of resistance profile or strength profile. So when I say resistance challenge, that's a term we use that kind of combines all of those things, because it's not just the resistance profile of the exercise where the machine is hard, but also factoring in what are the leverages of your joints, where is the muscle tissue that's moving that joint strongest. So it's layering all those things together. So the easiest way to find this, you don't have to know physics. You just do a rep. Where is it hard? That's the resistance challenge, right? You don't have to get out the protractor, the calculator, or anything else. But understanding where these exercises are hard will dictate somewhat of what type of stimulus or like physiological result you're going to get from those. So if we're looking at going into the more lengthened stuff that's becoming more and more popular, we're probably going to choose things that are at least getting us closer to a lengthened position and are relatively more challenging, closer to that lengthened range where that muscle is a little more stretched. If you were going for metabolic focused purposes and maybe you were trying to reduce some of the things that come along with lengthened bias training, which could be longer recovery times, some inflammatory stimulus, things like that, maybe then you choose to go more towards the shortened end of the spectrum for resistance challenge and muscle, etc. So those are whole topics in and of themselves, but for hypertrophy purposes, a greater portion, I would say, of the training, I would bias more towards the lengthened range and lengthened challenge resistance profiles, but I wouldn't neglect the short position stuff either, more so from an orthopedic and like neurological perspective, especially if you're trying to maintain strength, like for a sport, for example, because strength is like position specific and movement specific. So I wouldn't neglect any of those things either. Just say, oh, this paper says lengthen is better for hypertrophy. I'm just going to do lengthened everything all the time. Not going to waste my energy on short position stuff. And I was like, that's probably not the approach I would take for really anyone I would work with.
Boom. Yeah. So just seeing what part of the range of motion the exercise bias is going to be important, but also even where it's the toughest as well too is going to be important. And like you said, with hypertrophy work, like you said, there's been a ton of research coming out on lengthen work, and it seems like people are falling on that pendulum where it's like, oh, just do lengthen. But like you said, we also want to make sure we get some shortened. And so really, it seems with that, we just want to make sure that we have a good balance of everything in there when we're training for hypertrophy. We just don't want it to be one or the other to the extreme with that.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be the same program all the time either, right? So maybe you do a program where it's all lengthened, but then your next program, you're deloading or whatever. Now you do more short and bias stuff in that program, and then you come back and do your all lengthened stuff. So there's a lot of ways you can do it. Again, that's where it just comes back to understanding the program design and periodizing your program and not just doing the same thing for 12 months straight.
And again, like we said, you can get a lot out of, to go back to your analogy, you can get a lot out of, hey, just going in and training and whatnot. But again, if you want to take this next step and get a little bit more nuanced with hypertrophy training and be more efficient with it, like these are things that you're going to want to look at here to make sure that you have for each of your exercises. Is there anything else that you maybe want to sum up or go over in terms of, what makes a good hypertrophy exercise?
I'd say those are probably the main ones to focus on for most people. Yeah. Till we get into more detailed programming stuff.
Yeah. Would this change for somebody that's Gen Pop, a beginner or anything? Or would these still be things that you're pretty much, okay, no matter where you're at, like this is going to be super important?
I think it's still important. I would focus on different overall goals for a like brand new Gen Pop person than someone who's already been training for 5 years and has an idea of what they're doing. I'd want to focus on just teaching them how to move, like how to do the movements first. I'm not too worried about overloading or learn the movements. We'll do that for 2 months, 3 months, whatever. Then we can start loading it. So skill acquisition is my primary goal with someone very new. Then we can start adding in the other stuff. But that doesn't mean I still can't have them do a dumbbell press or a squat or a hack squat or lengthen, start to teach them the lat pull around when they don't have any bad habits yet, hopefully. So you can certainly teach them these more specific exercises as a beginner. There's no rule that says, oh, they have to learn compounds before they learn isolation, before they learn whatever. So it's the nervous system just takes repetition and you can get them to do it.
Yeah, because I feel like a lot of people think, oh, you don't need to worry about this. You just need to go in and whatnot. But like you said, it can be important to like you said, you want to get that skill acquisition, but it doesn't hurt to be able to learn some of these things. And again, why not get a little bit more out of your training if you are going to put the time into it anyways? That's my thought on it.
Yeah. Why not teach them how to do a lat biased pull down as opposed to just, oh, they just need a vertical and a horizontal pull and pull down, a lat pull. There's no reason you can't teach them that stuff right off the bat. And then you don't have to unlearn things later.
Yeah, that, like I told you earlier, that was the big thing for me is, all pull downs are the same. But man, once you can really learn the different arm paths and stuff like that, it really makes a big difference. And I've seen a big difference in my back. And I feel like the back, that's probably one that people struggle with the most, because I feel like no matter what you hear, that's always a muscle group that people are like, oh, I need to bring that up or something like that. And it makes sense with kind of all this stuff that's been coming out the last couple of years that you guys have been putting out, like the importance of kind of biasing that. It really does make a difference, especially the lats. I don't know if that's something that you see, but I feel like the lats specifically.
Yeah, I say so. I'm not sure what it is. Some people, they get it right away. I've actually had a couple of like people who are new that I taught to them and they picked it up right away, like the lat thing, because they hadn't been training back any specific way for any amount of time. They're like, oh, I just do this. Yep, that's it. You got it. Take it away.
Yep, that's it. Which I guess before we dive into, I do want to hit on some time-saving hypertrophy techniques. I think that will be super interesting. But from a back perspective and like length and partials, do you feel like the back specifically, I know there's no research that's been specifically done on the back, unless there has been something recently that I'm not aware of. But do you feel like the back really does benefit from doing some length and work?
Definitely. Specifically, and this is something that we've been diving into a little more recently, is the sternoclavicular component of the so I'll be teaching a lat clinic here with Adam in a couple of weeks in Ohio. We're going to basically go all through this. But as you get into that overhead position, like that very shoulder up, pull down type position where you hear a lot, oh, the lats have terrible leverage to extend the shoulder when it's above degrees or whatever. So that's true, but it doesn't lose leverage at the sternoclavicular joint, right? So as the lats contract, or as they lengthen rather, you will get that sternoclavicular joint elevating up in that pull down. The lats, as they pull on the humerus, still have the ability to drive that down. So doing partials with that movement, and we've posted some videos, Kasim has too, of doing just that sternoclavicular portion in the lengthened range, is very specific to the lats. So when you look at the shoulder extension portion from that overhead position, there's going to be a lot, like Terry's is going to be working a lot because it still has great leverage to do that. You're going to get more anterior or posterior delts. But if you just do the sternoclavicular movement, your Terry's and your posterior delts can't assist. They can't do anything there. They're just holding your humerus into your scapula at that point. So doing those partials there with just that kind of like depression movement in the plane of the lats is very specific to the lats. They're in a very lengthened position. So if you're really trying to specialize or bias lats, like you have a person's, my upper back's big enough, my lats are behind, that may be an opportunity for them to get more specific lat work in a lengthened position where they're not also getting fatigue or have fatigue of the other tissues being a limiter. I did post this video. We did lengthened partials with that sternoclavicular component in the prime pull down. The strength difference between doing that sternoclavicular like depression movement with the lats versus trying to do the shoulder extension component is drastic. And I'm talking like 40% more load. Like it's a big difference. So I think there's definitely some application for exploring more with the lengthened partials using the sternoclavicular joint for the lats. That's a big thing we've been exploring in our own training. So I'm hoping we can dive into that a little more in our own kind of experiments and research and stuff. So I think Cassim will have probably a really good section on that in the training guide that he's coming out with in collaboration with Milo Wolf.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's really cool. And I'm assuming that's a little bit different than like maybe some of the length and stuff you guys have been, like you said, been working on previously. And is this the one from September 12th probably that you are specifically talking about?
I believe so. It starts out where I'm talking about how I can't breathe.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. That's part of the thing is you're getting limited by how much you can breathe because it's so heavy on the amount of load you can use. And we were doing a drop set and I got 6 reps with whatever that weight was, like 7 plates or something.
Yeah. You have a lot on there.
Yeah. And like my normal weight for that is 5 plates doing the actual, like the full rep. So it's a pretty big difference.
And yeah, everybody, it's September 12th on your Instagram is where it is. And that range of motion is very short range of motion,
yeah,
which is crazy.
It's like a shruggy or reverse shrug type of movement. That's it. Yeah.
Cool. That's super interesting. Can you do that? Would you be able to do that on a pull down? Would the setup maybe be a little bit tougher or you would still be able to do that on a pull down and stuff?
No, you could definitely do that on a pull down or a high cable or something. You could potentially do it if you had a hammer machine. You'd have to set it up a little bit different. But yeah, if you just need something pulling in the plane of your arm in that position and you just contract your lats in that kind of depression-ish type of path. So
I guess the toughest part would be finding a machine, like a cable stack that would be heavy enough for some people too, would probably be one of the biggest challenges with that.
Stability will be a big limiting factor in that because of how much load you can use.
Essentially though, you could obviously just increase the rep range a little bit. But again, I'm sure once again, we go back to the specificity aspect of it. It's okay. Once you probably get too far away, then it's going to be something you have to consider there on that. Cool. Yeah, no. So September 12th that's the post there on that. Go check that one out. Cool. Is there anything else from that standpoint that you want to hit on or anything like that?
There's a ton we could. That's probably good for today without going down some rabbit holes.
Yeah, all this stuff, man. We could probably sit here and go down a ton of rabbit holes with it. And there's a ton that goes into it. Cool. If you have a little bit of time, do you mind hitting on some time-saving hypertrophy techniques to round up the conversation?
Absolutely.
Cool. Yeah. I'm just going to hand it over to you there on that.
Yeah. So the biggest one or the simplest is supersets, assuming your gym permits or logistically allows performing supersets, because even if you're trying to do 2 + 3 minute rest, doing straight sets, that's a full 2 to 3 minutes between every set of your exercise. Where if you superset like antagonist or unrelated muscle groups, maybe you can rest 75 to 90 seconds and just go back and forth between exercises. And now you're getting 3, 4, 5 minutes between sets of the same exercise. So you might actually be getting more rest for the same muscle group, but completing your workout more quickly. So I really like antagonist or unrelated supersets, provided they don't become too systemically challenging. So meaning it becomes more of a cardiovascular challenge than a muscular challenge. So that's where picking the right exercises to pair up or just making sure you have enough rest in between will be important.
Sorry, real quick on that. Could you maybe go over a couple that would to you? Again, I'm sure this is going to depend on the person and how they perform it, but what would be some common things where, hey, that's probably systemically just going to be too fatiguing. It's going to be more cardiovascular. Like you said, rest time is going to play a big role in that, but are there any off the top of your head that stick out to you that, hey, that kind of pairing is not great?
Yeah. Upper, lower supersets with a lot of muscle tissue. So like a squat and then a pull down or a hack squat and a chest press or something where you can get a lot of output in, you're going to need a lot more rest bouncing back and forth. So it may still save you time, but not as much time as if you were pairing your chest press with maybe a lat pull down or a dumbbell lateral raise or a calf press or something that there's less tissue working in a small amount of time, right? The density of tissue working is less. So that would probably be my consideration. I'm probably not going to try and superset hack squat and chest press with 75 seconds rest.
Yeah, not for hypertrophy. Yeah. So with that, again, just making sure they don't really big compound movements like that, maybe not the greatest for that. But if you do, you just have to rest a little bit longer. And then at that point, you have to weigh, is that saving you time at that point? But cool. Yeah. Sorry. I know you were going to go a little bit further on that before I stopped you there.
Oh, no, that was pretty much it. Like you could still absolutely do those larger exercises. You would just probably need 2, maybe 3 minutes rest between each exercise rather. So you'd probably still save time, but you'd have to give yourself a bit more rest. And that'll depend on the person too. If you've got a newer person or just someone who has a lower muscle to frame ratio, like they don't have as much muscle mass on them, right? Because the muscle tissue is what's, sucking up the oxygen and burning the glucose and stuff. So if you have less muscle tissue on your frame, you might be able to handle shorter rest periods and that type of stuff, just because the systemic stress you're creating isn't as much as someone who has 100 pounds more muscle on the same size human, right? Because your lungs and stuff don't get bigger as you add that much more muscle tissue to accommodate that.
So again, it's also going to depend on the amount of muscle that you have there as well too. Antagonists, supersets. What about same muscle group supersets? Would that ever be something that you would throw in as a time saving technique as well?
Potentially. That's where it would probably be only for the things that have a good division or a good separation between divisions. So like a clavicular and a costal, there's going to be very little overlap between those two movements for the pecs because they're very different arm paths. They're like almost 45 degrees to one another, 90 degrees to one another. So you could potentially superset something like that, or an iliac lat pull down and a thoracic kind of pull or something like that. Same muscle, but different enough arm paths that isn't going to be a huge overlap in fatigue between the two necessarily. So if you wanted to do that, you could. It probably wouldn't save you a ton more time than just doing them as straight sets, maybe 5 minutes total. But if you need those 5 minutes because you have a 50-minute lunch break that you're trying to get in, then that's what you got to do.
So you're going to be more likely to probably push from a time saving perspective, which is important. You're probably going to push for that opposing muscle group type superset there on that from a time saving perspective.
Yeah. Or like I said, non-competing. Yeah. So you can do like a pec press and then a dumbbell lateral raise or something.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to be opposing muscle groups, just something that doesn't compete with the other.
Yeah.
Cool. And anything else on supersets? Is there anything specific that you would, from like a programming perspective, that you would recommend or have anybody look out for if they are doing this specifically or anything like that?
From a logistical standpoint, just pairing like cables with cables and dumbbells with dumbbells are usually easier. That's what I do for people in busy gyms. It's like, all right, you're just going to camp out on the cable station for 20 minutes and get half your workout done right there. And then we'll go to dumbbells and we'll do the same thing. That's just a logistical thing. So you're not trying to run around the gym and hold 2 pieces of equipment at once or anything.
Because then once you do that, then when, like you said, you're in a busy gym, then it's probably not going to be a time saving thing. And it's just going to be a frustrating thing because people are going to be taking the piece of equipment that you need there on that. So cool. All right, so supersets, that's one. What would be some other potential time saving hypertrophy techniques?
Potentially like a rest pause type of method, just because you can get a little bit of a couple more reps in the closer to failure in a shorter amount of time. I don't know the exact math, and I guess it would depend on the person and the exercise, but maybe you could save yourself the time of doing 1 or 2, maybe extra sets over the course of the workout for that muscle group by adding in a rest pause type of technique. And for those who aren't quite familiar with rest pause, basically you will do your set either close to failure. So maybe 1, 2, 3 reps in reserve, something like that. You can do it all the way to failure if you want. I typically have people stop 1 to 2 reps in reserve. Then you rest anywhere from 10 to 20 seconds, depending on what the exercise is. And then you will, with the same exact weight, attempt to go to failure, maybe try it one more time, rest 10 to 20 seconds, one more set to failure. And you can do it. You can do 1 rest pause. You can do 2, 3, 4. Once you get past 3, I think you're doing like Myo-reps or something at that point, which is just another like rest pause type technique, right? There's different versions of it. But basically the idea is you're getting more reps that are close to maximal effort or close to failure. So, and people attribute those to, they call them like significant reps, right? Those last couple before failure are where you're doing the most, getting the most tension or most work. So that's the theory behind that. And you can do those for 2 sets, 3 sets, what have you. For those, I would say there's only certain exercises they work really well for. Like dumbbell presses don't work really well for rest pause, just because you have the setup of the exercise that takes a lot out of you, right? So you do a set of 6 with hundreds, and then you got to set them down, and then you got to count 15 seconds. Then you got to get set up again. And so you just wasted a rep and a half, 2 reps right there of energy before you do them. So that's where I would opt for a machine press. Even if the arm path isn't as good, I can get more work done in a stable environment, and I'm not wasting fatigue setting up the exercise between our rest pauses. So I guess from a practical programming perspective, maybe you do your dumbbell presses because those are whatever you get the most benefit or specificity or what have you out of those. And then you do one rest pause set on a machine press where you can just knock that thing out, get a lot of work done in a short amount of time and move on. So yeah, obviously I'm probably not going to try them on squats or leg press or something unless you got a really good spotter. But yeah, cable stuff works really well. Machine stuff works really well for that rest pause type technique.
Cool. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Again, we don't want to do it for, like you said, things like squats, things that require that you can fail on basically. And something like a squat, like that would be super challenging. Yeah. And then, like you said, dumbbells too, you do spend some time like getting that rep up, or if it's like an incline press or overhead press or something like that. What about like how often, so it can be a way again to get some more effective volume in like a shorter amount of time, again, hence time saving. What's the fatigue cost of that? Is that something that maybe would you recommend training like that all the time? Or is this, hey, just towards the end of a cycle, we're going to do it? Or is it really just simply going to come down to the RAR that you're training at there with it?
It'll be all of the above. I will actually use it as like a progression technique for people, where if I think either they're time limited or I think adding a whole extra set or 2 to get those reps in might just be too much total volume for their body to handle, I'll add in a rest pause method as an effort and as a way to just add a little bit more tension or volume of tension work to whatever muscle group we're working on, or most muscle groups in some cases. I think the fatigue cost, it's going to partially, like you said, be dependent on the rep range or the reps in reserve. But at least in my experience, I don't feel that it's as fatiguing as doing an entire another set to get the same number of reps, right? So let's say I do 8 reps with 2 in reserve. Let's say for the sake of math, we'll count the last 4 reps before failure as significant, and just for the principle's sake. So we get two reps there that quote unquote count, and I rest pause and maybe I get 4 more, and then I rest pause and I only get 2 more. So I got 8 total reps that quote unquote count. Whereas if I did the 8 reps, did a complete rest, and then took another set to failure, I got 2 in the first one and 4 in the second one. I got 6. But I also had the first half of that additional set that wasn't as quote unquote stimulatory, but it was still fatiguing because I'm using the same load through the same range of motion. So the overall fatigue cost might be a little more if you're trying to do full rest and additional sets. I could go either way on that. I could also make the argument that if you're taking full rest, you might be able to use on average heavier loads across adding another set. So it's one of those things where in theory, I could argue it either way under different conditions. If we're just going for the sake of I'm limited on time, I would say the rest pause is going to be better because you might not have time to take another 3 to 5 minutes rest and get in a whole other set or 2 to get the same number of reps near failure. So that's where I'd say in the conditions that you gave me were time limited, I'd probably go for the rest pause rather than trying to add extra sets with full rest because I don't have that time available.
Yeah. And I'm sure that this is something that with coaching clients, you also have to take into consideration. So I've been more prone to adding in more myo-reps, a rest pause as a way to add sets. Just as you mentioned there, I feel like too, when you add in like straight sets, does the quality potentially go down as well too in that training? Whereas like rest pause, I feel like it can get you straight to the point. And again, it's from a mental standpoint, you don't have to sit there and rest and try to get a whole nother set in. So that's where I found it to be super effective. And I'm sure that's your the similar kind of thought process as well too on that with adding those in. So you did mention myo-reps as well too. You said they're all the same. Is there any like main difference between them, or is there anything that we need to worry about with that, or would you just consider them the same, or is it just come down to how you label them and whatnot?
I think they're on a spectrum of like how much rest are you taking, how close to fatigue are you going, and how many little additional sets are you doing.
Okay.
So like on one end, maybe you have like cluster sets where you're staying further away from failure. You're resting 15 seconds. You do 3 or 4 of those. And then maybe on the other end, I guess you could say you have myo-reps where you're pretty much going to failure, resting is made to failure, so on and so forth. And then like you have your kind of variable rest pause method somewhere in the middle, like the one I described, where you couple reps in reserve, short-ish rest, failure, maybe 1 more, like That's your middle ground.
So there's some small differences. At the end of the day, they're all very similar, and just the exact kind of nuances of it are just going to be a little bit different. Cool. Is there any other time-saving hypertrophy techniques that you like to utilize?
I'd say the last one is a K.A.S set if it's doable for people. So it was invented by K.A.S, but he actually named them K.A.S sets because it stands for kill all sarcomeres. That's where the K.A.S comes from. So basically, you're doing the same exercise or similar exercise and changing the resistance profiles to essentially fail at every point of the range of motion. So what that looks like is an easy example would be like a lateral raise. So you have a dumbbell and you have a cable that's set up at wrist height. So something that's overloaded short, something that's overloaded lengthened. You start with the short one, you pause 2 seconds in the short position, and you're aiming for 6 to 8 reps with maybe like 1 rep in reserve, maybe 2. Then you immediately go to the lengthened biased one and go to failure. So you're failing in the lengthened part of the range. Then you go back to the short one right after, no rest, and you do basically whatever range you can achieve and fight into it for 2 seconds. So what will happen is as you fatigue through that final like set, your reps will get smaller and smaller and smaller until basically you can't move. So you're hitting failure in the lengthened position in the second part with the lengthened exercise. And then you're hitting failure everywhere from the short all the way down in the second one. And the important part in the second or the end of that set is that you're actually fighting into the resistance for 1 to 2 seconds. So you're not just going up, that's it, and come back down. You're like trying to push through that sticking point. So it's driving a lot of, basically it's maximal muscle recruitment. Whatever you can get, you're getting because you're trying to consciously fight into it. So that's one. It's very stimulatory. It's very fatiguing, but you can get a lot done in a short amount of time. So if I've got someone I have 30 or 40 minutes and I got to train half my body, K.A.S sets, if we can do it. It's hard to do for every muscle group unless you have special equipment. The dumbbell example for the dumbbell and cable for the lateral raise, dumbbells and cables for biceps. I think I have a series on the training site that goes through like all of the non-prime machine versions with cables and dumbbells and stuff that you can do in most gyms. So it is doable, even if you don't have the fancy Prime Fitness equipment with the adjustable resistance profiles and stuff.
Awesome. Yeah, that sounds freaking brutal as you were saying that. And then you said, yeah, it's very fatiguing and whatnot. It makes sense.
Yeah, that's something is like maybe 2 sets is probably about all you're going to do. It's like you do a warm-up set, you do 2 of those, and that's it for the day.
Yeah, and very effective. So again, time saving. So one you didn't mention, and this may fall under rest pause, but like drop sets. What are your guys' thoughts? Is it maybe, and again, maybe it falls under the rest pause, but is the thought that, hey, since you're dropping the weight, that maybe it's just not as productive because the amount that you're using just drops as you go on, or would you categorize that under rest pause?
No, I would categorize that as its own thing. I'd say I would use that more in a metabolic fashion than if I'm going for maximum mechanical tension, especially with the thought process of trying to recover quickly. And I'm not trying to completely bury myself because I want to be able to maintain a certain amount of training frequency. But that being said, if you have a shortened or mid-range kind of exercise, something that's not super overloaded lengthened, you could probably tolerate a drop set just fine and train again in 3 days, depending on how many times you did the drop set, how many drops you did, etc. So that's where the exercise selection would probably come in more handy. Like I'm going to be a lot more sore trying to do a drop set on a hack squat than a leg extension. So the exercise selection plays a big role there.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Yeah, I didn't know I feel like the more research that's come out lately, I haven't heard too much about drop sets and whatnot there. So that makes sense. Cool. Is there anything else that you want to go over from a time-saving hypertrophy technique?
I think those are probably the main ones that I can think of. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I think those are super cool to implement just because I don't know how this is for you maybe, but for me, the longer I've been into training, the more I'm like, man, I just want to make my sessions not last longer than 60 to 75 minutes. I just find that the quality goes down. And then obviously for people that do have a busy life, and again, maybe they don't like working out as much, I feel like being as efficient with the time as you can is super helpful there with that. So awesome, Cody. Appreciate your time. I guess before I let you go though, is there anything coming out from an N1 standpoint or anything for you that you want to share with the audience or anything like that?
Yeah, I touched on the training guide that K.A.S is working on. That should be really good. He's been working on that quite a bit. So part of the reason it's taking so long is they are going through every study they can find on length and bias training and volume and resistance, and they're evaluating them. Everything is cited and everything. So if people want to go double check And we always encourage that. Don't just take our word for it. Read it for yourself if you want to. And trying to boil it down, or I guess clarify it into take-home points that people can get out of what these research papers actually do say, conclusions we can draw, conclusions we can't draw, which is just as important, or things we can't say based on XYZ study, because those often pop up and get misinterpreted too, to try and give people like a holistic overview of what they can do if they really want to pursue like length and bias training, how to use it, how to use like the partials, integrated reverse drop sets, progressing into partials, all the different techniques, what exercises they work well for, what exercises they don't work well for, to give people like a really good, solid understanding for that. So hopefully that'll be out by the end of the year. And then we've started doing some new specialty events. So we have a hypertrophy camp, which is basically for the people who just want to teach me how to program for hypertrophy. I want to get more bigger. How do I do that? So we're doing 2 full days on that. We have a transformation, which is like fat loss, coming up in December. So all things fat loss, training, everything. And then we've been doing some collaboration events. We've got Luke Lehman coming at the end of this month. We're going to do a 4-day event with him. And then, we'll see what next year brings as far as practicals, program design, all that fun stuff.
Awesome. Yeah. And so that's cool. That guide specifically is around length and training there on that. So that will be super cool. Can't wait to see that. I'm sure that will be super popular and whatnot there. And hopefully there's more and more research that comes out with length and stuff. I know it's a hot topic right now, so I'm sure that people are busting out research on it. So cool. Cody, appreciate your time, man. And we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks for having me.